It was said in the yellowed archives of Redhollow County that certain doors should never be opened after sunset. It was a phrase repeated among the older residents, noted in the margin of a report from that time, as if the clerk had heard it more than once before recording the phrase. But it is only when one revisits the documents from 1871, maps, fragmented testimonies, recovered letters and search reports, that this seemingly superstitious warning takes on an unsettling form. It is in this scattered collection of papers that the central figure of this story emerges. Eleanor Whitford, the widow who ran a modest boarding house on the eastern edge of Redhollow on a dirt road that used to serve as a passageway for travelers, peddlers and workers heading inland. Eleanor was not a woman who attracted attention. Records describe her as discreet, methodical, polite, and always dressed in a sober manner. She had been widowed early, 3 years before the events, when her husband, Samuel Whitford, fell victim to a violent bout of pneumonia during a particularly cruel winter. Since then, she had run the boarding house alone, with the quiet discipline of someone who learns to survive through repetition. According to testimonies collected in 1902, Eleanor was respected and, to a certain extent, protected by the community, which saw in her quiet strength a kind of rare dignity. In 1871, the Redhollow region lived off small businesses and the passage of strangers on their way to mines or new lands further west. There was nothing there to catch the attention of historians, until a strange series of disappearances occurred between April and September of that year. 22 travelers, all adult men from different counties, disappeared after passing through the region. The last recorded stop for 16 of them was Eleanor's boarding house. The other 6 were never seen entering there, but reports from residents indicate that they were last seen a few miles from the property. The official documents are restrained, almost cold. The sheriff at the time, Jonas H. Caldwin, noted in 1873 that the region lacked communication and infrastructure for more in-depth investigations. The searches were scattered, dependent on volunteers and, above all, on the imprecise memories of residents, many of whom were illiterate. Even so, there are details that appear repeatedly. The stifling heat of that summer, the smell of damp wood in the boarding house hallway, the unusual silence after nightfall, and Eleanor's punctual routine of lighting the lamps at the same time every day. The widow's property appears on all maps of the time. A simple 2-story house built of dark boards, flanked by a small barn and surrounded by a dense forest that limited the view of those coming down the road. At the rear, there was a smaller annex, known in the records as the Night Devotion Room. It was a space attached to the second floor, with a single narrow window and a door leading to the main hallway. It is not known who named the room. Some attribute it to Eleanor herself, others to her late husband, and still others say it was just a custom of the time to name rooms according to their purpose. But no record explains with certainty why that space was mentioned so often in the testimonies. Neighbors described the widow's routine as predictable. She closed the windows at dusk, checked the locks on the front door, and went upstairs carrying a lamp. Sometimes they heard slow footsteps after midnight, always coming from the hallway that led to that room. There were no screams, no arguments, no noise suggesting conflict. It was the kind of silence that, according to one of the last statements from an elderly resident, did not seem natural in the house of a living woman. It was only decades later, when revisiting old reports, that historians noticed a detail that seems to have gone unnoticed by the authorities at the time. All the missing travelers had registered at inns, hostels, or rest houses in previous cities, except when they arrived in the Redhollow area. The documents indicate that, for many of them, Eleanor's boarding house was their first stop after days on the road. They arrived exhausted, covered in dust, in search of hot food and shelter. Some left notes in diaries recovered by family members. They described the boarding house as quiet and organized, and the hostess as a reserved woman with attentive eyes. The last relevant note preceding the mystery is in a diary found 10 kilometers away, belonging to a traveling salesman. He wrote, "They say that the widow Whitford keeps a room that no one enters. A room for night prayers, they say. A space of her own. Some people avoid the boarding house because of this. Still, I'll take my chances. I'm too tired to continue my journey. The man never reached his final destination, and among the dozens of files that remain from the case, it is precisely this seemingly mundane note that marks the beginning of the profound strangeness that enveloped Redhollow that year. And it is here, at this intersection of silence, routine, and disappearances, that this story really begins. To understand the disappearances that haunted Redhollow in 1871, one must first delve into the seemingly ordinary routine that preceded those months. Documents from the time, mainly letters from residents and accounts preserved by descendants, offer an intimate glimpse into life in the region, revealing a quiet daily life marked by small repetitions that, together, shape the setting in which everything happened. The road that crossed the village was the main link to the rest of the county. It was an uneven path, lined with huge oak trees and strips of tall grass that swayed in the wind. In the summer, it kicked up enough dust to dirty the facades of the houses. In the fall, it became heavy, almost muddy. Eleanor Whitford's boarding house was a few meters from this road, elevated on a small slope, allowing the widow to watch who was coming even before they knocked on the door. Travelers of the time described the boarding house as a simple but comfortable place by country standards. The walls were dark wood, and in the main room there was a long table where Eleanor served meals to those who stayed overnight. A wood stove burned from dawn until late afternoon, heating the room and maintaining a constant smell of broth, fresh bread, and burning wood. The few residents who frequented the place say that Eleanor spoke little, but always greeted them with a discreet nod before returning to her tasks. The widow's daily routine followed an almost ritualistic discipline. She woke up just before sunrise, lit the kitchen lamp, checked the condition of the wooden floor, and then prepared breakfast for the guests, usually consisting of porridge, bread, and a cup of tea. She then spent hours tidying the rooms, washing clothes in a makeshift sink in the back, and making small repairs to the furniture. This routine is mentioned repeatedly, as if its predictability were a kind of pillar of the community. Still, some testimonies point to small details that, seen decades later, have taken on a different tone. The first of these concerns the so-called night prayer room. No one in the community remembered using this space when Eleanor's husband was still alive. It was only after she became a widow that the room came into constant use, always after dusk. There is a testimony from Martha Clifton, a neighbor of the property, who reports having seen for over a year the light of the lamp burning behind the narrow window of the room. She asked the widow about it on one occasion, but received only a short smile and a vague explanation. "That's where I keep my prayers and my records." The records, however, were never found. Another clue that seems discreet, but which recurs in several reports, is Eleanor's mood swings at certain times of the month. Some residents claimed that she became more withdrawn, avoiding conversation and even avoiding eye contact with visitors. It was on these specific days that she spent more time in the adjoining room, going in and out several times after 10 p.m. But none of this raised any suspicions at the time. In the 19th century, peculiar habits of mourning and devotion were common. Solitude, especially for widowed women, was rarely questioned. The community accepted these behaviors as part of a quiet and disciplined life. Meanwhile, travelers continued to arrive. Many of them were workers trying their luck in newly discovered mines in neighboring counties. Others were peddlers selling household items or agricultural tools. Some came from far away, and perhaps for this reason, upon arriving at the boarding house, they noted in their diaries the sense of relief at finding a place to sleep. These accounts, though fragmentary, are essential to understanding the emotional tone of the time. One of these travelers, later identified as Thomas Warrington, wrote in his diary that he had found an atmosphere of unexpected peace in Eleanor's home. He described his hostess as reserved but extremely attentive, and mentioned a detail that, at first glance, seems irrelevant. He noticed that, when showing him to his room, Eleanor completely avoided looking at the closed door at the end of the hallway. Another traveler, Adam Kellard, recorded hearing light footsteps on the second floor around 1 in the morning. At the time, he thought it was another guest. It was only weeks later, when his belongings were found abandoned miles away, that his diary became a subject of study. According to him, the footsteps seemed to measure the house, as if someone were walking rhythmically from the hallway to the staircase door and then returning without opening any doors. This type of report is repeated. Small sounds, the light that remained on, the strict nighttime routine, the footsteps, always the footsteps. The region's climate also contributes to the backdrop of the mystery. The summer of 1871 was stifling, with long, hot nights that caused many guests to leave their windows ajar. It was common for the sounds of nature, insects, breaking branches, the distant cry of some animal, to mingle with the internal noises of the house, creating a silent but restless atmosphere. However, despite these elements, nothing seemed to indicate any real danger. Travelers arrived, slept, thanked their host for their hospitality, and continued on their journey. At least, that was what was believed. Most of them had no ties to the region, and their disappearances were only noticed much later, when distant families pieced together fragments of information sent in letters or found among the men's belongings. The last significant point in the records prior to the disappearance concerns a specific change in the widow's routine. From mid-June of that year, Eleanor began locking the main door of the boarding house before sunset, something she had not done before. She also began refusing guests on specific days, especially when they arrived at dusk. This was reported by at least 3 men who found lodging in neighboring houses after being rejected by the widow. None of these details, taken individually, pointed to anything concrete, but together they form a succession of silent, almost cinematic scenes that precede what was to come. And it is precisely at this point, on the border between the everyday and the unknown, that the mood of the story begins to change, still without witnesses to notice, but already clearly recorded between the lines of the archives that have survived the passage of time. The events recorded between late July and early September 1871 represent the core of the mystery surrounding the widow of Redhollow and her boarding house. It is during this period that the last confirmed reports of missing travelers occur, all of them described in official documents, personal notes, and later testimonies collected decades later. Reconstructing this sequence of events requires navigating fragments, gaps, and silences. But it is precisely in these silences that the real atmosphere of those nights takes shape. The last month before the collapse of the investigations began with the arrival of Jonas Merrow, a young blacksmith traveling in search of work. He arrived at the boarding house in the late afternoon of a particularly hot day, carrying a small backpack and a coat that seemed too heavy for the weather. His name appears in the guest register written by Eleanor herself, a list written in firm, organized handwriting, which historians found stuck under a loose board in the kitchen decades later. According to this document, Merrow had an early dinner that day, thanked her for the meal, and went up to his room. He noted in his own diary a seemingly simple detail. The widow seems tired. She carries a lamp with both hands, as if afraid the flame will go out. It was the last sentence he ever wrote. Residents say that on that night the wind began to blow in an unusual way. The trees around the boarding house bent, and the noise of the leaves drowned out more distant sounds. Still, some reports mention seeing the light of the lamp burning in the night prayer room long after midnight. The heat and deep darkness seemed to create a distorted impression of the shadows seen through the narrow window of the room. What is known is that at dawn, Jonas Merrow's bed was made but empty. There were no signs of conflict, escape, or haste. His belongings remained folded beside the small wooden table. Eleanor told her neighbor that same day that the young man had left early, before sunrise, something many travelers did. It seemed plausible, and no one questioned it. But Merrow never made it to the next village. Days later, another traveler entered the records. Lucien Graves, a salesman of household goods known for carrying a bag full of samples. He was last seen walking down the Redhollow Road in a light rain that had begun just before dusk. A farmer's testimony indicates that he was walking quickly, as if seeking shelter. Eleanor's boarding house was the only possibility that night. From then on, only fragments remain. A few loose notes, a meal receipt, a report from the postman who saw a lamp lit in the upper hallway, and a comment made by Eleanor to a neighbor. The weather has demanded too much of us all. Lucian Graves disappeared without a trace, and the sample bag was never found. It was also at the end of August that a crucial piece of the historical record emerged, the testimony of Henry Balford, a local farmer, and one of the few residents who occasionally shared brief conversations with the widow. Years later, he reported to the sheriff an event that at the time seemed strange, but not alarming. One night, while returning home after helping a neighbor with repairs to his barn, he saw Eleanor standing at the back door of the boarding house, holding an unlit lamp. She seemed to be looking toward the woods. She remained there for a few moments motionless. Balford greeted her from a distance. She just nodded and went back inside. This description coincides with a pattern noticed by modern scholars. On the nights before the disappearances, the widow's routine changed. She took longer to climb the stairs, left the door ajar for a few seconds, walked more slowly, and according to some residents, seemed to sleep even less than usual. In the first week of September, the case took a clearer and more disturbing turn when Charles Ender, a traveler who was making his way between 3 neighboring counties, disappeared shortly after leaving the boarding house. He left a note in an unsent letter found next to his abandoned belongings that the night had been restless. He wrote, "I heard footsteps in the hallway twice, not from someone walking randomly, but from someone who knew exactly where they were stepping." This letter is often mentioned as one of the key pieces of evidence in the file. It also mentions a specific sound, a slight creak, as if someone had slowly opened a door and then carefully closed it. This detail coincides with the testimony of another previous traveler, whose name is illegible in the preserved documents, but who reported the sound of a door opening by itself when the wind pushes it. However, there was no wind that night. The last indirect witness to the recorded events is Nathaniel Crow, a hunter who passed through Redhollow Road in the second week of September. Years later, he stated that he saw the narrow window of the annex open for the first time. The lamp was not lit. He found this strange, as he had always seen that light on in previous nights. Upon closer inspection, he noticed that the window looked slightly crooked, as if it had been forced open. Crow said he felt something wrong in the silence, but could not explain what he meant by that. That same day, Eleanor appeared at the local market wearing simple but visibly worn clothes. Some reports say her face looked pale. Others say she avoided conversation, limiting herself to buying bread and a small amount of firewood before returning to the boarding house. It is not known what happened that night, only that the next morning the road was empty and silent, and no travelers appeared to ask for shelter. The following hours are described in reports from the time as the moments when the sense of normality broke down. Henry Balford, concerned about the unusual silence at the boarding house, decided to go there. He found the front door ajar, but not open. He knocked once, then again. Finally, he pushed the door open. The hallway was tidy but cold. The lamps had not been lit the night before, something Eleanor never failed to do. Balford slowly climbed the stairs, calling the widow's name. When he reached the upper hallway, he noticed that the door to the prayer room was ajar. The soft light of dawn illuminated the wooden floor, revealing recently stirred dust, as if someone had crossed the hallway a few hours earlier. He pushed the door open with his fingertips. The room was empty. There was no furniture except for a small chair facing the narrow window. On the floor lay an unlit lamp. The flame had died hours earlier. Next to it, an object caught his attention, a piece of torn fabric that did not belong to the widow's clothes. When Balford went downstairs to warn the neighbors, he found the front door now wide open. But Eleanor was nowhere to be found. And from that point on, the narrative in the archives becomes fragmented, confusing, full of speculation. Nothing concrete, nothing definitive, just a silence that would echo for decades. And it is precisely in this abrupt silence, with the empty room, the lamp turned off, and the front door open, that the documents end the last confirmed moment before the story plunges into its consequences. When the open door of the boarding house was finally noticed by neighbors the morning after Eleanor Whitford's disappearance, the village of Redhollow entered a state of unrest that is difficult to describe in official documents. There were no signs of violence, no traces of escape, nor any clear indication that anything criminal had occurred. But the simple fact that a woman known for following almost liturgical routines had left her house open and had not been seen since the previous evening made the community realize that something had definitely broken. Henry Balford, the first to enter the house that morning, reported to the sheriff that he found nothing out of place except for the deep silence that filled every room. He said the atmosphere felt heavy, as if the air had been compressed during the night. This type of description is recurrent in the case statements, not concrete facts, but sensations, perceptions, impressions that are difficult to put into words. The authorities at the time did not give them much importance, but modern historians understand that, in the gaps in the archives, it is these small details that illuminate the emotional state of the community. Sheriff Jonas H. Caldwin arrived at the boarding house a few hours after being notified. His written report remains preserved in a stiff leather folder, marked by the rust from the clip that held it together. The text records that the kitchen was clean, the clothes folded, the lamps extinguished, and the night prayer room empty. According to the sheriff, no objects appeared out of place. The only item that caught his attention was the piece of fabric found by Balford, which was kept as possible evidence, although it was never linked to any of the missing persons. Neighbors quickly gathered to help with the search. In the 19th century, it was common for the entire community to mobilize in situations like this, and that's what happened in Redhollow. Men, women, and even teenagers formed small groups to search the woods around the boarding house. They looked for trails, marks on the ground, footprints in the mud, broken branches. Nothing. One of the most significant searches took place along the road connecting Redhollow to the neighboring village. There, they found signs of disturbed dust and small prints on the ground, but none of them were clear enough to determine whether they belonged to the widow or to a traveler who might have left the area that morning. The residents' reports then begin to show patterns of concern. Martha Clifton, Eleanor's neighbor, told the sheriff that in the days before her disappearance, she had heard sounds coming from the upper annex that didn't just sound like footsteps, but something more rhythmic, like calculated movements. Another resident, Walter Fenrick, said he had seen lights on in the boarding house later than usual, and that on the last night Eleanor was seen, he had observed her silhouette standing at the window. He said she seemed to be staring at something in the distance, but he could not identify what it was, as the darkness of the woods hid any shapes. These statements, when read in isolation, may seem like subjective perceptions, but when analyzed in conjunction with the sequence of travelers' disappearances and the fact that many of them were registered as guests of the widow, they take on a significance that goes beyond coincidence. The investigations continued over the following months. Sheriff Caldwin sent letters to neighboring counties asking about missing travelers, describing their physical characteristics, approximate age, and possible routes. He received a few responses, all inconclusive. None of the men were located. No concrete clues emerged. It was only in the winter of 1872, almost a year after the widow's disappearance, that a crucial fragment resurfaced. A letter from a relative of Jonas Merrow, the missing blacksmith, stating that the young man had written, weeks before he disappeared, about a strange feeling at the boarding house and about a room that the widow locked every night. This letter arrived too late to contribute effectively to the investigations, but it helped confirm that reports of footsteps, lights turning on, and unusual behavior were perceived by the guests. The most shocking revelation, however, did not come from anyone related to the missing persons. It came from the boarding house structure itself. During one of the last searches of the property, volunteers removed boxes and old objects from the main attic. Among them was a small hardcover notebook, apparently used by Eleanor's husband years earlier. Scholars believe that some of the notes were erased over time or by improper handling, but some pages remained legible. In them, Samuel Whitford recorded domestic habits, bills, purchases, and small reflections on daily life with his wife. But one sentence in particular caught the attention of historians. Eleanor has been spending too much time in the adjoining room. She says it is to keep up her devotions. But there are nights when I hear footsteps when she is not there. The sentence is dated October 1868, 3 years before the events of 1871. This note, although brief, gave new meaning to the whole case. It showed that, long before the disappearances, there had been strange behavior and unexplained sounds in that house, and that the widow's own husband had noticed these anomalies, without being able to explain them, and without the courage to investigate them further. From this point on, the documents take on a more emotional tone. The community began to deal with the widow's disappearance as if it were just another in a long line of disappearances surrounding her story. Some residents believed that she herself might have run away, unable to cope with the pressure and fear resulting from the searches. Others thought she had suffered the same fate as the travelers, but no one had any proof, and no one ever found the body. The remaining traces, the tidy room, the unlit lamp, the piece of fabric, the door open at dawn, became the only concrete pieces of an incomplete puzzle. The final revelation of this block, however, comes from a detail that went unnoticed during the original investigations, but which modern scholars found when cross-referencing reports. On the night before the widow's disappearance, all the lamps in the boarding house were turned off much earlier than usual, except for the one in the upper hallway, which remained lit until about 2 in the morning. This information appears in 2 statements from different residents and coincides with the crooked window observed by Nathaniel Crowe on the same night. It means that someone was in that room after Eleanor went upstairs. It means that there was activity in that part of the house. And it means, above all, that the last confirmed presence in the boarding house, the last person who walked down that hallway and turned on that light, was not found in the following days. It is this coincidence, coupled with the silence that followed, that forms the darkest point in the Redhollow archives, and it is from this point, where the clues dissolve and only time remains as a witness, that the case finally belongs to memory and no longer to facts. Decades after the disappearances that haunted Redhollow, the surviving archives remain stored in wooden boxes, their papers as fragile as the fine dust that covers old libraries. Most of those involved had already died when historians began to revisit the case more carefully, trying to piece together the scattered pieces left behind. It is here, in this last block, that the figure of the narrator-historian, the one who sifts through decayed documents, compares testimonies and tries to decipher the silence, becomes essential. Over the years, the name Eleanor Whitford slowly faded from collective memory. For many residents who grew up in subsequent generations, she became just a shadow mentioned in oral histories, a lonely widow whose life blends into the mists of the road. For scholars, however, she remains the focal point of a narrative that has not been closed, not for lack of interest, but because the circumstances of the time made any definitive conclusion impossible. Upon opening the old reports, the historian is confronted with the words of Sheriff Jonas H. Caldwin, always concise, always technical, attempting to record the truth with the coldness required by his position. But it is in the letters of travelers, in diaries forgotten in trunks, in testimonies recorded decades later that the human texture of the case is found. In these pages, it is possible to smell the damp wood of the boarding house, mentally hear the sound of footsteps in the hallway, visualize the lamp swaying in the dark, and realize how much the absence of answers transformed the episode into something greater than a simple disappearance. Over time, scholars began to connect patterns, the repetition of lone travelers disappearing, the constant mention of the night prayer room, the lights on after midnight, the footsteps, the silence, the torn fabric. Each detail, when revisited, composes a kind of diffuse narrative that, while not revealing what actually happened, suggests that life at Eleanor's boarding house gradually became more charged, more tense, further from normality. It is at this point that the historian's personal reflection becomes inevitable. Rereading the note left by the widow's husband, that solitary sentence lost in his account book, it is impossible not to wonder what Samuel Whitford witnessed in the annex during the nights when he heard footsteps, what he felt when he realized that his wife spent hours alone in that narrow room, and, perhaps most disturbingly, what he chose to ignore. Modern investigations have found no concrete evidence linking the widow directly to the disappearances, but they have also found nothing to completely rule her out. Eleanor vanished without a trace, and her absence became as enigmatic as that of the travelers who passed through her door. The fact that she disappeared after years of strict routines, and precisely on the night the lamps were turned off early, reinforces the feeling that something had changed inside the house, something that had perhaps been quietly building up since her husband's death. Redhollow's documents do not explain what happened within those walls, but they make it clear that the mystery is not due to extraordinary events, but rather to the sum of small human decisions, intimate fears, prolonged silences, and invisible pressures that shaped everyday life in the 19th century. The vulnerability of lone travelers, the emotional isolation of a widow, the lack of resources for investigation, the fragility of lives taken away from their families by roads that no one controlled. In the end, the historian finds no answers. He finds echoes in letters never sent, in accounts tinged with longing, in pages burned by time. Echoes that reverberate when he closes the last folder and realizes that what haunts him most is not what has been discovered, but what could never be documented. Redhollow County went on with its life. The boarding house was abandoned, then overgrown, then demolished. The road changed. The trees grew. The night prayer room, whose narrow window illuminated the darkness for decades, ceased to exist physically, but its image remains alive in the archives, in memories, and in the unsettling void left by 22 people who left without return. At the end of his research, the historian writes one last note, not for the official documents, but for himself. In it, he tries to express the silent weight he felt when revisiting everything. Perhaps the most disturbing thing is not the disappearance itself, but the fact that no one ever heard a last sound. No door slamming, no cry for help. Just silence. A silence so absolute that it seems to outlive us all. This sentence concludes not only the study, but the narrative itself, and it leaves the reader, as well as the viewer, with the only possible conclusion. Some disappearances are never solved. They just keep echoing, like half-open doors that time has never closed.